Hello everyone and welcome to our second video tutorial on statutory interpretation. The first one was an introduction to the topic. This is the second video where we're going to start looking at some of the rules, some of the approaches to statutory interpretation. And the first rule that we need to look at is the literal rule. So that's what this video is going to be on. Now, before we look at how the literal rule is used by judges in courts, I think it's important for us to consider for a moment how we're using the word literally in day-to-day language, first of all, because the way judges use the word literally is the correct way and not the way that the general public is using it and driving me absolutely bonkers at the moment. So we all know that literally means in a literal sense as opposed to a non-literal or an exaggerated sense, and it's the opposite of figuratively, which means in a metaphorical sense. But now what we're seeing in day-to-day language is that people are using the word literally as an intensifier, as a super strength, really, or actually, like literally so overused. And I've got some examples here that just drive me mad. Things like this: I literally died. Well, you didn't though, did you? This one, Kim, I literally can't even. I mean, what? Finish your sentence? I just want you to be aware before we start looking at this rule today that when we're using the word literal, we are meaning in a literal sense. So what you can see here from this slide is that actually there are four approaches to statutory interpretation. And the judges will use these different approaches when they're interpreting statutes or acts of parliament. Now, I'm going to do a separate video on each of these rules, but today, as I've said, we're going to be focusing here on the literal rule. So we're going to start off by looking at the definition of the literal rule. So the definition of the literal rule is that the judge gives words their plain, ordinary, or literal meaning, even if the result is not very sensible. I've got a quote here from Lord Esher, which is really good to put into an answer in the exam. So Lord Esher has emphasised that if the words of an act are clear, then you must follow them, even if they lead to a manifest absurdity. I guess you might be wondering, how's it possible? How, if you're giving words their literal meaning, how does that lead to a not very sensible result? How does that lead to a manifest absurdity? And in order to sort of give you an example of this, I go back to when Seb was very young. I think he was about 2 at the time. He was playing football and Liam was coaching. And Liam said to Seb, because he was all over the place, looking everywhere, he shouted an instruction to him. He said, "Seb, keep your eye on the ball." And you can imagine what a 2-year-old's going to do. He sort of paused for a second, looked at Liam. You could tell he was thinking, this doesn't seem logical, but doing it anyway. He gets down onto his hands and knees. He puts his face on the ball, his eye actually on the football. And then Liam sort of looks at me with an exasperated look on his face, like, what on earth is he doing? And I said, eye on the ball. And then the penny dropped. To Seb, who didn't really understand, he was giving the words the plain, ordinary, literal meaning. So when Liam said, keep your eye on the ball, he interpreted that as meaning, put your eye on the ball. Obviously, the result was not sensible at all, and you could see even from Seb him thinking, why am I doing this? But he went ahead and did it anyway. And I think that's quite interesting as well from another perspective, because it comes back to really what Lord Esher's saying here. Because Esher says that if the words are clear, then you must follow them, even if they lead to an absurdity. Now, why is he saying that? Why is he saying that you've got to follow words if they lead to an absurd result? Well, if you think about what Seb was doing, he sort of thought it was a bit of a stupid thing to do, but his dad has told him to do it, and he's respecting his dad, even though he doesn't think it's very sensible, by doing exactly what he's been told to do. And if you think about that in the context of the courts, if the words of an Act of Parliament are very clear and they are saying a particular thing, then it's not really for the judge to say, oh, well, I think that's daft. I'm not going to apply that. I think he meant to say this. Remember that the Acts of Parliament are passed in a democratic way, whereas judges are not elected, so it would be undemocratic if judges were making law. So what Escher is getting at here is that if Parliament has been quite clear with their wording, then it's not for judges to tinker with that. They should apply the law exactly as it's said. If we have a look at some of the classic case examples of this, it will help to illustrate a bit further that the literal rule does actually lead to absurd results in a lot of instances. If you remember back to the previous video, the case of Cheeseman, which we looked at, Cheeseman was another example of where the courts used the literal rule. And I'm sure you remember that case because it was all about a man who was caught by police masturbating in a public toilet. And in that case, the judges were using the literal rule to interpret an Act of Parliament which said that it was an offence to upset passengers on the street. And in that case, the judge, if you remember, looked up the meaning of the word passenger from 1847 when the Act was written and discovered that it meant passerby or pedestrian. And the judge chose to use the literal rule and said, well, the police were not pedestrians, they were not passers-by, so therefore he hadn't committed an offence. Lots of people would, of course, say that's an absurd result because if he's doing the same action, it shouldn't really matter if it's a passerby or it's a police officer that sees it. So that was a case we looked at last time, but we're going to have a look at some others today. So we're going to start with Whiteley and Chapel, and you can see that this is another ancient case from 1868. And in this case, you've got the facts here. And our defendant was posing as someone who died in order to vote at an election. And he was caught out pretending to be somebody else in order to vote, and he was being prosecuted. Now, the Act of Parliament that he was being prosecuted under had this particular phrase. And you'll notice in your booklet that you need to write the facts, and we also separate out the words that need to be interpreted and also the outcome. And when you're writing up answers to the exam, you need to make sure that you've learnt the words that need to be interpreted and that you say them word for word, and then also give the outcome as well. So this particular Act of Parliament said that it would be an offence if the defendant was impersonating any person entitled to vote. And the judge chose to use the literal rule here, and he said, well, when you look at what the guy was doing, he was posing as someone who died, and dead people are not entitled to vote. So therefore, he hadn't committed an offence. And you can see there in your outcome, our defendant wasn't guilty because when you were applying the literal rule, a dead person can't vote. Clearly, that's an absurd result because the whole point of this Act of Parliament surely was just to prevent people from posing to be someone else in order to vote. Our defendant here just got lucky, I suppose, in a way, in that he was posing as someone who'd already died. But at the end of the day, he is still committing a fraud and really should have been found guilty. So when we're using the literal rule, you can see that the judges are respecting the exact words that are included in the Act, but sometimes that's going to result in what we describe as an absurd result. In our second case here, we've got the case of Fisher and Bell. And again, this is illustrating that the literal rule can lead to an absurd result. This case was about a shopkeeper, and he'd put some flick knives on display in his shop window. So they were in his window, essentially with price tags on, and he was being charged with a criminal offence. Now, the Restriction of Offensive Weapons Act from 1959 said that it was an offence to offer for sale knives, contrary to this Act. So the words that needed to be interpreted were offer for sale. Now, to most people, to the general public, I'm sure you would think that if an item has got a price tag on, it's being placed in a shop window, then surely that's offering for sale. But actually, using the literal rule, it isn't technically an offer for sale. We study contract law in our second year, and we'll discover that actually, if you're advertising items for sale in a shop with a price tag on, that's not technically an offer for sale. It's called an invitation to treat. And it's actually the customer who picks up the item who is then making the offer for sale. So you can see here in our outcome that our defendant wasn't guilty under this act because technically it wasn't an offer for sale, it was an invitation to treat in the law of contract. And again, that's a really absurd result because clearly the purpose of the Restriction of Offensive Weapons Act, the whole point of that act, presumably, was to restrict people from selling of these weapons. And here, that purpose is being frustrated. And it's also absurd, of course, because what it actually means is that no shopkeeper is going to be guilty of this offence because they'll be doing an invitation to treat. It's actually the customer who makes the offer for sale. So it would be the customer who would be guilty under the Restriction of Offensive Weapons Act, which clearly is an absurd result. And our final case on the literal rule is the case of Berryman. Now, this shows something slightly different. We use this example of the literal rule, not that it's absurd as such, but that actually sometimes the literal rule can be harsh. So if you look at the facts here, it's quite a sad case. Mrs. Berryman's husband was working on railway lines, and sadly he was killed whilst oiling points on this line. And as his widow, she was trying to claim compensation for his death. And the Act of Parliament said that compensation would be available if employees were, quote, relaying or repairing the track. So the words to be interpreted were relaying or repairing. But if we look back at what Mr. Berryman was actually doing, he was oiling points. Now, you can sort of predict, knowing the literal rule, what the outcome is. And sadly, Mrs. Berryman wasn't entitled to compensation because the judge said that oiling points was held to be maintenance or maintaining the track, and it wasn't relaying or repairing the track. Now, clearly, that's a really harsh decision because had he been walking down the track with a hammer and some nails and fixing some wood or something that's on the track, then he'd have been relaying or repairing. She'd have got the compensation. But just because he's using oil on the track, she's not entitled to claim. So it can be quite harsh as well. And interestingly, in this sort of fairly recent, or more recent, I should say, than Berryman anyway, in this case, Horan, the Secretary of State for the Home Department, the Court of Appeal actually refused to use the literal approach to a new piece of legislation because they felt it wouldn't reflect the intention of Parliament. And that's quite an interesting decision because it's showing the problems, I suppose, the disadvantages, or one of the disadvantages of the literal rule. That leads me on then just to draw your attention to the advantages and disadvantages of the rule. So for each of the 4 rules or approaches, you're also expected to be able to discuss the advantages and disadvantages. And obviously we've been touching on these as we've gone through the slides here. Advantages of the literal rule are that it's respecting sovereignty of Parliament. As I said at the beginning, it's preventing unelected judges from making law. Escher was very clear on the fact that if the words are clear, we should be using it. Scarman here making the point that we can only be governed by Parliament's enactments, not by its intentions. Making the point really that we can't jump inside Parliament's head, we can only apply the law as is written. Other advantages, of course, it's a certain rule, as we've seen. Once you know the definition of the literal rule, it's quite easy to predict the outcome in a case, and therefore it's going to be easier for judges and lead to quick decisions. And it's important that you also look at the disadvantages. They're all here on the slide for you. We've focused on the fact that primarily the literal rule leads to absurd or unfair decisions, Berryman, Whiteley, Fisher and Bell. Also look at these other critics.